The Atlantic slave trade can be understood through its sheer magnitude. For 366 years, European slavers loaded approximately 12.5 million Africans onto Atlantic slave ships. About 11 million survived the Middle Passage to landfall and life in the Americas. The Atlantic slave trade can also be understood through the experiences of a single enslaved person who endured a series of catastrophic events that severed him or her from home, family, and nearly all things familiar. Capture in the African interior, transport to the coast, sale to slave traders, and sale and enslavement in the Americas tested the spirit and will of resilient men, women, and children who struggled to find meaning and happiness in a new world, dependent upon their labor and coercion. While most people have heard about the Atlantic slave trade, very few are knowledgeable about the actual details. In this video, we will take you through history, back to the shores of the African continent, where Africans were considered commodities with a price tag meant for enriching the Europeans. The Atlantic slave trade was an oceanic trade in African men, women, and children, which lasted from the mid-16th century until the 1860s. European traders loaded African captives at dozens of points on the African coast, from Senegambia to Angola and around the Cape to Mozambique. The great majority of captives were collected from West and Central Africa and from Angola. The trade was initiated by the Portuguese and Spanish, especially after the settlement of sugar plantations in the Americas. European planters spread sugar, cultivated by enslaved Africans on plantations in Brazil and later Barbados. In time, planters sought to grow other profitable crops, such as tobacco, rice, coffee, cocoa, and cotton, with European laborers as well as African and Indian slave laborers. Nearly 70% of all African laborers in the Americas worked on plantations that grew sugarcane and produced sugar, rum, molasses, and other byproducts for export to Europe, North America, and elsewhere in the Atlantic world. Before the first Africans arrived in British North America in 1619, more than 500,000 African captives had already been transported and enslaved in Brazil. By the end of the 19th century, that number had risen to more than 4 million. Northern European powers soon followed Portugal and Spain into the transatlantic slave trade. The majority of African captives were carried by the Portuguese, Brazilians, British, French, and Dutch. British slave traders alone transported 3.5 million Africans to the Americas. In the 15th century, Portugal became the first European nation to take a significant part in African slave trading. Initially, Portuguese explorers attempted to acquire African labor through direct raids along the coast, but they found that these attacks were costly and often ineffective against West and Central African military strategies. For example, in 1444, Portuguese marauders arrived in Senegal ready to assault and capture Africans using armor, swords, and deep-sea vessels. But the Portuguese discovered that the Senegalese outmaneuvered their ships using light, shallow water vessels, better suited to the estuaries of the Senegalese coast. In addition, the Senegalese fought with poison arrows that slipped through their armor and decimated the Portuguese soldiers. Subsequently, Portuguese traders generally abandoned direct combat and established commercial relations with West and Central African leaders, who agreed to sell slaves taken from various African wars or domestic trading, as well as gold and other commodities, in exchange for European and North African goods. Over time, the Portuguese developed additional slave trade partnerships with African leaders along the West and Central African coast and claimed a monopoly over these relationships, which initially limited access to the trade for other Western European competitors. When the Portuguese and later their European competitors found that peaceful commercial relations alone did not generate enough enslaved Africans to fill the growing demands of the Atlantic slave trade, they formed military alliances with certain African groups against their enemies. This encouraged more extensive warfare to produce captives for trading. While European-backed Africans had their own political or economic reasons for fighting with other African enemies, the end result for European traders in these military alliances was greater access to enslaved war captives. To a lesser extent, Europeans also pursued African colonization to secure access to slaves and other goods. For example, the Portuguese colonized portions of Angola in 1571 with the help of military alliances from Congo, but were pushed out in 1591 by their former allies. The European traders generally relied on a network of African rulers and traders to capture and bring enslaved Africans from various coastal and interior regions to slave castles on the west and central African coast. Many of these traders acquired captives as a result of military and political conflict, but some also pursued slave trading for profit. Scholars provide various explanations for why African traders were willing to supply enslaved Africans to Europeans for the Atlantic trade. By the early 16th century, slavery already played a major role in some Western and Central African societies and contributed to maritime slave trade systems across the Indian Ocean and Mediterranean Sea. Subsequently, some historians argue that Europeans in the Atlantic took advantage of a pre-existing slave trade system in Africa to obtain labor for expanding plantation economies in the Americas. During the development of the Atlantic trade, West and Central Africa consisted of diverse political and social structures, ranging from large empires to small states, and these groups often conflicted over internal politics as well as economic expansion. Though ethnic identities were influential, these groups did not share a common African or Black identity. Instead, they saw cultural and ethnic differences, such as Igbo, Ashanti, Mende, and Fulani, as social divisions. Frequent conflicts between these groups produced captives who could then circulate in the local slave trade system, and eventually the Atlantic slave trade. Europeans also went to great lengths to influence African traders and leaders to provide enslaved Africans for the Atlantic trade. European traders encouraged African consumer demands for European goods, formed military alliances to instigate fighting and increase the number of captives, and shifted the location of disembarkation points for the trade along the West and Central African coast to follow African military conflicts. The Portuguese dominated the early Atlantic slave trade on the African coast in the 16th century. As a result, other European nations first gained access to enslaved Africans through privateering during wars with the Portuguese, rather than through direct trade. When English, Dutch, or French privateers captured Portuguese ships during Atlantic maritime conflicts, they often found enslaved Africans on these ships, as well as Atlantic trade goods, and they sent these captives to work in their own colonies. In this way, privateering generated a market interest in the Atlantic slave trade across European colonies in the Americas. After Portugal temporarily united with Spain in 1580, the Spanish broke up the Portuguese slave trade monopoly by offering direct slave trading contracts to other European merchants. Known as the Asiento system, the Dutch took advantage of these contracts to compete with the Portuguese and Spanish for direct access to African slave trading, and the British and French eventually followed. By the 18th century, when the Atlantic slave trade reached its trafficking peak, the British, followed by the French and Portuguese, had become the largest carriers of enslaved Africans across the Atlantic. The overwhelming majority of enslaved Africans went to plantations in Brazil and the Caribbean, and a smaller percentage went to North America and other parts of South and Central America. Europeans used various methods to organize the Atlantic trade. Spain licensed other nations to supply its Spanish American and Caribbean colonies with African captives. France, the Netherlands, and England initially used monopoly companies. In time, the demand for African laborers in the Americas was met by more open trade, which allowed other merchants to engage in trade with Africans. Thus, formidable private trading companies emerged, such as Britain's Royal African Company and the Dutch West India Company of the Netherlands. Such companies operated in major ports to construct, finance, insure, and organize slave ships and their cargoes. The profits generated from the Atlantic trade economically and politically transformed Liverpool and Bristol in England, Nantes and Bordeaux in France, Lisbon in Portugal, Rio de Janeiro, and Salvador de Bahia in Brazil, and Newport, Rhode Island in the United States. Each port developed links to a wide hinterland for local and international goods in Asia and the capital to sustain the trade in African captives. European merchants and ship captains, followed later by those from Brazil and North America, packed their sailing vessels with local goods and commodities from Asia to trade on the African coast. African traders made specific demands for European goods in exchange for African captives. Enslaved Africans were exchanged for iron bars and textiles, luxury goods, cowrie shells, liquor, firearms, and other products that varied region by region over time. Throughout the trade, The Africans who were enslaved or threatened with enslavement consistently resisted the dehumanizing confines of this institution. Villages and towns built fortifications and warning systems to prevent attacks from traders or enemy groups. Others retreated to more defensible geographical regions, such as lakes or escarpments, to escape attacks and capture. As a result, some African communities experienced stagnation because of dislocation. Elsewhere, states collapsed under the pressure of violent slave trading and extreme population loss. If captured and forced onto ships for the Middle Passage, enslaved Africans resisted by organizing hunger strikes, forming rebellions, and even committing suicide by leaping overboard rather than living in slavery. Scholars believe that roughly one slaving voyage in every 10 experienced major rebellions. These rebellions were costly for European traders and led them to avoid certain regions known for this resistance strategy, except during periods of high slave trade market demand. This resulted in fewer Africans entering the Atlantic slave trade from these regions. While some African societies resisted the European demand for slave labor, many coastal societies benefited from trading with European ships. Europeans provided a host of tempting goods: textiles, ironware, exotic drinks, and firearms, all in exchange for African captives. Without African middlemen, local traders who had access to internal supplies of captured African peoples, Europeans could never have hoped to acquire more than small batches of Africans. Equally, without the commercial attractions of goods imported by the Europeans, African traders would have had little reason to secure ever more victims from their internal African suppliers. The conditions for enslaved Africans crossing the Atlantic Ocean in the Middle Passage were brutal and deadly. Slaver ships were specifically designed for maximizing the numbers of African men, women, and children that slave trading captains and their crews could bring to the Americas. Once on board, crew members segregated enslaved Africans by gender and then chained and packed them closely together in shipholds. Captives then endured up to several months of extreme temperatures, harsh weather, filthy living conditions, and contagious diseases in these shipholds as they crossed the Atlantic Ocean. Roughly 26% of Africans who endured the Middle Passage were classified as children. Captains chained men for the longest periods to prevent rebellion, and enslaved women often suffered sexual assault from crew members. The conditions on slave ships were so harsh and unbearable that from 13 to 19% of Africans died in the Middle Passage. Mortality rates were particularly high during the first few centuries of the Atlantic trade before shipping technology improved to shorten the length of the overall voyage. Though the ocean passage may only last a few weeks, the overall Middle Passage often took months because European slave captains lengthened the voyage by making stops in various African ports to seek more slaves to fill their shiphold. They also made numerous stops in American ports to attempt to sell their enslaved cargo at the best prices. Slave traders sold enslaved people in a variety of ways. Some traders delivered Africans directly to merchants who had placed orders with the shippers. Other Africans were sold on auction blocks to the highest bidders in major ports like Port-au-Prince, Bridgetown, or Salvador de Bahia. For many Africans, the terrifying ordeal was the scramble, where purchasers raced among the assembled captives, grabbing and claiming the ones they wanted. Arrival in the Americas did not mean the end of an enslaved person's journey. The Caribbean islands were typically the first landing for many Africans before the ship captain sent them off on another voyage to the slave markets on the mainland of North, South, or Central America. In this way, an extensive intercoastal American slave trade existed, linking the business and shipping interests of Caribbean merchants with those in North, South, and Central America. In Brazil, for example, newly arrived Africans faced resale, followed by an onward march to distant settlements and plantations. In the Caribbean as well, slave ship captains often shipped Africans to other islands, including Spanish colonies in Central and South America, and even slave markets along the Pacific coast. When their maritime journeys ended, Africans were moved on, yet again. African survivors who arrived in Jamaica and Saint-Domingue, now known as Haiti, were marched to develop new properties or replace enslaved people who had died from harsh labor and living conditions. In North America, local slave traders marched Africans overland to be sold to property owners in the developing backcountry of the Carolinas. In the 19th century, Their descendants were to be uprooted and moved yet again to the new cotton and sugar frontiers of the southern United States. From capture in Africa to their final sale in the Americas, enslaved people experienced loss, terror, and abuse that challenged even the strongest-willed and most resilient among them. At every point of this horrific journey, the business of the slave trade and the enslaved individual's role as commodity was present. Exchange, trade, and profits were the engines of the transatlantic slave trade, a trade that yielded profits and bounty for Western Europeans and American colonists on a remarkable scale for nearly 4 centuries. Much of the wealth generated by the transatlantic slave trade could support the creation of industries and institutions in modern North America and Europe. To an equal degree, profits from slave trading and slave-generated products funded the creation of fine art, decorative arts, and architecture that continues to inform aesthetics today. Looking back to the Atlantic slave trade, it is difficult to imagine that a system that once treated human beings as commodities, with price tags, was not only legal, but was considered to be ethical and a major source of wealth, influence, and respectability for many. The impact of the Atlantic slave trade has been devastating for African communities, and its legacy can still be seen today. The trade disrupted local economies, as villages and towns were attacked and people were taken away, leading to a loss of human capital. Many African countries were left without a viable labor force, which meant that they were unable to develop economically. The slave trade also contributed to the underdevelopment of Africa by removing skilled labor from the continent. As a result, Africa became a source of raw materials rather than a producer of finished goods, and this legacy can still be seen in many African countries today. The political impact of the Atlantic slave trade on Africa was also significant. The trade was responsible for the destabilization of many African societies, as European powers encouraged and supported intertribal warfare in order to capture more slaves. This created political instability and weakened African states, making them vulnerable to colonization and exploitation. The trade also contributed to the spread of diseases in Africa. Europeans brought with them diseases like smallpox, which ravaged African populations, making them even more vulnerable to the slave trade. The loss of life and the destabilization of societies had a long-lasting impact on Africa. In addition to the economic and political effects, the Atlantic slave trade also had a profound cultural impact on African communities. The trade disrupted traditional societies, as people were taken away from their families and communities. It also contributed to the loss of African cultural heritage, as slaves were forced to adopt European customs and language. Despite the devastating impact of the Atlantic slave trade on Africa, there are many examples of resilience and resistance. Many African communities fought back against the slave trade, and there were numerous slave rebellions throughout the Americas. These rebellions were often led by slaves who had been brought from Africa and who sought to reclaim their freedom and their identity. Today, the legacy of the Atlantic slave trade can still be seen in many African countries. The underdevelopment of many African countries can be traced back to the slave trade, as can the political instability and the cultural disruption that occurred. However, there are also signs of progress and resilience, as African communities continue to grow from the terrible past that kept them stagnated for centuries. The Atlantic slave trade was a dark and shameful period of human history. It was a period of cruelty, exploitation, and injustice that had a profound impact on the world we live in today. We must remember the millions of people who suffered and died as a result of this trade, and we must work together to build a more just and equitable world for all. Thank you for joining us on this journey through history. If you enjoyed watching this video, do not forget to like and subscribe.